Here's a comment I keep seeing. Jews only like the UN when it suits them. You accepted the 1947 Partition Plan but reject everything else the UN does. Hypocrites. And here's my response. You are confusing two completely different things. The UN recommending a partition in 1947 and the UN institutionalizing hereditary refugee status through UNRWA for 75 years are not the same policy, not the same context, and not the same organization, really. Accepting one UN proposal while criticizing another isn't hypocrisy, it's evaluating each on its merits. So today, let's talk about the UN's two faces. How one resolution tried to solve a problem and how another made sure that the problem never gets solved. Shalom, I'm Igal and this is Middle East in less than 5 minutes. Let's take a deeper look into this. 1947, the Partition Plan. Let's start with 1947. World War II just ended. The British mandate over Palestine is collapsing. The British are tired, broke, and want out. They dump the problem on the brand new United Nations. The UN forms a committee. UNSCOP, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. They study the situation and come back with a recommendation. Partition. Split the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state. Jerusalem becomes international. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly votes. Resolution 181, the Partition Plan, passes. The Jewish leadership accepts it, not because the borders were perfect, not because they got everything they wanted, but because it was a path to statehood. A compromise. A chance to finally have a homeland after centuries of persecution and a Holocaust that just murdered 6 million Jews. The Arab leadership rejects it completely, not because the borders were unfair, but because they rejected the very idea of a Jewish state, any Jewish state, on any borders. And the very next day, Arabs start attacking Jewish communities. Civil war breaks out. Then, 5 Arab armies invade the moment Israel declares independence in May 1948. But here's a key point. The 1947 Partition Plan was a proposal to solve a problem. It was a diplomatic effort to create 2 states and avoid war. It failed, not because of the UN, but because one side said yes and the other side said no. 1949. UNRWA is born. Now let's talk about what happens next. The 1948 war ends. Israel survives, but there are refugees, Arabs who fled or were expelled during the war. Estimates range between 600,000 to 750,000 people. This isn't unique. The 20th century was full of refugee crises. Partition of India, 15 million refugees. Post-World War II Europe, 12 million ethnic Germans expelled. Greeks and Turks exchanged after their war. Millions of people displaced, resettled, moved on. But for Palestinians, the UN did something different. In 1949, the UN created UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, a special agency just for Palestinian refugees. Not for all refugees, just Palestinians. And here's where it gets insane. UNRWA made refugee status hereditary. If you fled in 1948, you are a refugee. Okay, that makes sense. But if your children are born in Lebanon, raised in Lebanon, have never set foot in Israel, they're refugees too. And their children? Also refugees. And their children's children? Still refugees. This is the only refugee population in the world where the status passes down through generations. The UN's own refugee agency, UNHCR, doesn't work this way. When Vietnamese boat people fled to America, their kids born in America weren't refugees. When Somalis fled to Kenya, their kids born in Kenya weren't refugees. But Palestinians, 4 generations later, they're still refugees. 5 million people who've never been displaced, classified as refugees. Why UNRWA is different. Here's what UNRWA does that no other refugee agency does. It doesn't resettle refugees. It doesn't help them integrate into host countries. It doesn't work towards solutions. It maintains them as refugees, permanently. UNRWA runs schools that teach Palestinian kids they are going back to villages that don't exist anymore. It prints maps that show all of Israel as Palestine. It employs teachers who are Hamas members. It stores rockets in its facilities. It digs tunnels under its schools. UNRWA doesn't solve the refugee problem. It perpetuates it. Why? Because the refugee problem is a weapon. It's a political tool used to delegitimize Israel. As long as there are millions of refugees with a right of return, Israel can never have secure borders. The conflict can never end. That's not a bug, that's a feature. Two completely different things. So let's be very clear about what we are comparing here. The 1947 Partition Plan was a proposed solution. 2 states, compromise, peace. UNRWA is institutionalized victimhood, hereditary grievance, a UN agency designed not to solve a problem, but to preserve it. One tried to end the conflict, the other makes sure the conflict never ends. Accepting the first while rejecting the second isn't hypocrisy, it's common sense. The Hypocrisy Accusation. When people say you only like the UN when it suits you, what they're really saying is, you should accept everything the UN does without question. But why? The UN isn't the voice of God. It's a political body. It passes resolutions based on votes, and votes are political. In 1947, the UN had 57 member states. Most were Western or aligned with the West. The Soviet bloc supported partition because they thought a socialist Jewish state would be in their camp. The vote passed 33-13. Today, the UN has 193 member states. The Arab and Muslim bloc is huge. They vote as a bloc. They control the General Assembly. They've passed more resolutions condemning Israel than every other country combined.
Wow!
Is that moral authority? Or is that politics? The UN Human Rights Council has had members like Libya, Saudi Arabia, China, and Venezuela, countries with horrific human rights records sitting in judgment of Israel. The UN General Assembly declared Zionism is racism in 1975, a resolution so absurd it was repealed in 1991. But it shows you what the UN is capable of when the votes align. So when someone says you accepted partition but rejected UNRWA, the answer is simple. I accept proposals that try to solve problems. I reject institutions that exist to perpetuate them. Evaluating on merits. Let's apply this logic elsewhere. Imagine a court recommends mediation to end a dispute. You accept. Good idea. Then the same court creates a permanent department whose only job is to keep the dispute alive forever. Pass your grievance down to your children and make sure no one ever moves on. Would you accept that? Would rejecting the second thing make you a hypocrite for accepting the first? Of course not. The 1947 Partition Plan had merit. It proposed a real solution, 2 states, and the British mandate that Jews and Arabs govern themselves. UNRWA has no merit as a solution. It's a bureaucracy that feeds off the conflict. It employs 30,000 people. It has a $1.6 billion annual budget. Solving the refugee problem would put them all out of work. You think they are incentivized to solve it? The double standard. Here's another angle. Why is there a special refugee agency just for Palestinians? When India and Pakistan partitioned, millions were displaced on both sides. Hindus fled Pakistan, Muslims fled India. Huge refugee crisis. Did the UN create a special agency for them? No. Did it make their refugee status hereditary? No. Those people resettled, moved on, built new lives. When Jews were expelled from Arab countries after 1948, over 850,000 of them, where was their UN agency? Where was their hereditary refugee status? Where were the camps maintained for 75 years? There weren't any. Those Jews went to Israel. Israel absorbed them, settled them, gave them citizenship, moved on. But Palestinians, the Arab countries that host them, refused to give them citizenship, refused to let them integrate, keep them in camps, and the UN funds it. Lebanon won't let Palestinians work in most professions. Syria keeps them in camps. Jordan gave some citizenship, but not all. Egypt won't let them leave Gaza. Why? Because keeping them as refugees keeps the conflict alive. And keeping the conflict alive keeps the focus on Israel. What UNRWA actually does. Let's be specific about what UNRWA has become. UNRWA employees have been caught celebrating terrorism. UNRWA schools have been found with Hamas tunnels underneath. UNRWA textbooks teach kids that all of Israel is occupied Palestine. UNRWA staff participated in the October 7 massacre. After October 7th, evidence came out that UNRWA employees were involved. The UN investigated, quietly. Some got fired. Most countries resumed funding anyway. This isn't a refugee agency. It's a jobs program for Hamas sympathizers funded by Western taxpayers. Israel has been saying this for years, and for years the world ignored it, called it Israeli propaganda. Then October 7th happened, and suddenly, whoops, turns out Israel was right. The real hypocrisy. You want to talk about hypocrisy? Let's talk about hypocrisy. The UN created a partition plan in 1947 to give both Jews and Arabs a state. Arabs rejected it and started a war. The UN created UNRWA in 1949 to deal with refugees from that war. A war that Arabs started. A war they lost. So, the UN rewards the losing side of a war they started by giving them a permanent refugee agency, hereditary victim status, and billions in funding. Meanwhile, Israel, which accepted the partition plan and got invaded for it, is condemned by the UN more than any other country on earth. That's hypocrisy. Why this matters? This isn't just about history. This is about why the conflict never ends. As long as UNRWA exists, as long as refugee status is hereditary, as long as 5 million people are told they are going back to villages that don't exist, there will be no peace. Because peace requires compromise. It requires accepting reality. It requires moving forward. UNRWA does the opposite. It institutionalizes the past. It makes grievance a permanent identity. It teaches generations of Palestinians that they are owed something that will never happen. And that's cruel. Not to Israelis, to Palestinians. You want to help Palestinians? Dissolve UNRWA. Let UNHCR handle it like every other refugee population. Resettle people, give them citizenship. Let them build futures instead of nursing grievances. But that won't happen, because the UN, the Arab states, and Palestinian leadership don't want solutions. They want the conflict. So when someone says Jews only accept the UN when it suits them, here's the answer. We accept proposals that try to solve problems. We reject institutions that exist to perpetuate them. The 1947 partition plan tried to create two states and end the conflict. We accepted it. Arabs rejected it. UNRWA exists to keep the conflict alive forever. We reject it, and we are right to. That's not hypocrisy, that's clarity. Evaluating things on their merits isn't selective, it's called thinking. Maybe the UN should try it sometime. I'm Igal, and this is Middle East in less than 5 minutes. Until next time, Shalom.